So welcome to the Social Magnetic Attraction podcast. And on this episode today, I want to talk about elements of depression and how it is people get depressed and how it is people can resolve it, and kind of the very, very unconscious nuances that no one likes to talk about. I'm going to try and talk about now. And also as mentioning about certain things in the media, things like Chester from Linkin Park, Robin Williams, Chris from Audioslave, why is it they committed suicide and stuff like this. So I actually want to start with that, the end in mind first. So starting with these celebrities, oftentimes when you look at these celebrities, they've gone through a series of addictions. They sleep around. They've done substances addictions. They're chronic workaholics, and what ends up happening is, as a child, we're almost like clean slates. And because of our family of origin, if we've been raised in a very dysfunctional family, I know that's a very, you could argue that most families are dysfunctional, which you could argue is very true. But I'm talking a chronically dysfunctional family, where you could argue it being called a low nurturance family. It's probably a bit more appropriate. When they've come from these very hostile environments, there's been very little love given to that child. It's almost like this love-impoverished family. There's no one really there to soothe the child and be there for the child's needs and be there to protect it. And then when we don't, in our first, I call it the sacred years, the first 0 to 10 years are such a sacred time because we have these dependency needs. We need to get it from another individual. And unfortunately, because the child is so vulnerable, he cannot do it on his own. And what ends up happening is the child then begins to create coping mechanisms to try and get that love. It's such a valuable currency to a child. So this is where the people-pleasing comes from. This is where even doing things like being a perfectionist comes from, being a caretaker for a parent, taking care of their parents' emotional needs so they get their physical needs met. This is where narcissism stems from, and things like this. Now, as well, because that child is not being allowed to express their anger, this is a big thing, which I'm going to talk about. When the child is not allowed to express its anger, usually around the age of 2, the child will go through a phase of what's called oppositional bonding. And this is where the child begins to separate away from the parent's identity, and then they begin to merge their own, or they begin to generate their own identity. And this is where they start saying no, and this is where they say don't. And these words are your boundary words. And usually at this time in a child's life, their toddler years, if the parent is like, don't say no to me, how dare you say no to me, and begins to shame the child's no, that's really their biggest boundary. And if they can't express their anger towards their parent in a healthy way, and if the parent is shaming them for their anger, they'll learn to repress it, and it ends up getting suppressed over time, and it goes unconscious. And they end up not expressing their anger. And our anger is our protection, as well as a massive, massive grieving tool. That is a humongous grieving tool. In terms of my own emotional healing, that has been a humongous thing to eradicate fear, shame, anxiety, and it cuts off the repetition compulsion as well, which is where you repeat certain things from childhood. When you do your anger work, you grieve out that energy. Our emotions are energy. They're energy in motion. And when we don't emote them, when we don't physically emote them outwards, they stay inside of us. And anger, unexpressed, gets turned towards the self, and it mutates into self-hatred. And this is where a lot of depression comes from. In terms of a lot of family systems, lots of our society, especially I found as well for women, this has been a massive shaming because it's not feminine. It's considered a more masculine trait. And it can be even more shaming for guys when they haven't had the ability to express their anger. They feel less than a man. They haven't had the ability to be assertive when they were younger. So now in their adult state, they can be victims of, manipulation, very toxic relationships and stuff like this. So, in terms of women that are getting their anger shamed, you have to think about, as a woman, physiologically speaking, men have more muscle mass. They have an element of physical strength. So to a woman, she doesn't really have that, She's a smaller being, she has a smaller bone structure, not as much muscle mass, and her anger is a massive form of protection. And if she does not have her anger, she's very vulnerable to abuse, emotional, physical abuse, whatever it is. So, in our society, we need to learn to, at least in our kind of private time, express our anger, to grieve out a lot of this pain from our childhoods, these childhood losses of not being able to express it. And over time, that is a very, very healing modality. It's actually one of the main 4 grieving techniques, which I'm going to talk about. And you see it with a lot of, these celebrities where they've gone through a series of, sex addictions, they're addicted to drugs, physical substances, they have eating disorders. And again, it's trying to mask that physical pain, that very unconscious pain from their childhood. And, it's very, very shaming to a child when a child cannot get his love. It's basically signaling to the child, the parents' eyes are kind of their mirror reflections back at the child. They form their identity through their parents in some cases. And when they do not get this love, it's basically saying you're worthless. You are unlovable, and I don't like you. You're a nuisance, whatever it is. And it sends the wrong signals to the child, and this is what creates that toxic shame. Toxic shame is probably the biggest source of addictions in our culture, that it's that very pervasive feeling of inadequacy. I'm flawed, I'm defective, I'm worthless, and this is where all the self-hatred comes from. There is a healthy shame. Healthy shame shows our limits, shows where our boundaries are, where other people's boundaries are. When we make a mistake, that's healthy shame. It's the permission to be human. It's the source of our humility as human beings, that we are not God. And, this is where, when people don't have healthy shame, they're either shameless, they're more than human, or ashamed, less than human. And this is where, the shameless behavior comes from, chronic perfectionism, moral superiority, being this high-achieving academic. If I can make everything else perfect, it'll counterbalance my self-hatred. It's a very unconscious thing. Less than human, totally ashamed, doing drugs in the alley, having sex with strangers, not taking care of myself, I'm less than human, and stuff like this. And when we don't go through the externalization process of externalizing the shame, the fear, the anxiety, all this pain carries with us into our adulthood years, and it's very, very unconscious. It bleeds through into our psyche. Any unconscious elements within the ego will get acted out. It's kind of like, I view toxic shame as like this vortex that just keeps replicating on itself. There is something what's called confirmation bias, that whatever you believe, you find evidence for. And whatever, if you think you're a worthless human being, you have to, and you have all these beliefs, I'm worthless, I'm unlovable, I hate myself, whatever it is, what ends up happening is that you will go into social environments that reconfirm that belief to you, and this is cognitive bias. You will reconfirm certain things in your environment to reenact certain things in your childhood because it feels familiar. There's that law of familiarity. The word familiar stems from the word family. And if you've come from a very dysfunctional family of origin, you have to think of the family unit as like a social system, that you will actually go into social environments to try and find where you can play your role. So what if you were a caretaker, this high-achieving super achiever, whatever it is, you were the scapegoat, you had all that target practice put on you, you were the one that all the anger got dumped on, you were responsible for the family's problems, stuff like this. You will actually go in environments where that actually feels the same. And this is highly, highly destructive. And it's only until we begin to grieve out that pain that we really feel whole again. We have this hole in our soul. I heard this amazing quote I think it was on Oprah, and they said, we have these holes in our souls, and usually they're in the shape of our mothers and fathers. And it's because we haven't had that protection, we haven't had that nurturance, that love, that guidance, the discipline, healthy discipline. And you look at all these celebrities who they've gone to extreme amounts to achieve, extreme amounts to look amazing in everyone else's eyes. Robin Williams, for example, had an Oscar for not being funny, had his own TV show, he had multiple films, he made the whole world fucking happy, and then he was the only one who was not. And even at that level, you could argue, I think a lot with actors, they're doing these roles sometimes so they can express, they can emote some of these emotions they've not had chance to in their relationships or in their family of origin. Maybe it be anger or sadness. Even to, with Chester as well, you look at his lyrics in his songs and, like these wounds will not heal and stuff like this, and I'm crawling in my skin, and, it's very, very, very like venomous and corrosive and very hurt lyrics, and it really comes out in his music. Even to this extent, when they've reached high level of success, they still hate themselves because they have not grieved out the pain from the family of origin. And this is what is, the biggest driving force in a lot of addictive behaviors, to try and mask that physical pain, that emotional hurt. So just to name some of the grieving processes that you can try yourself, which I have found extremely beneficial, just to go over the 4 major ones, it is angering, crying, ventilating, and then fully feeling. So just to go over them really quickly. So you have angering. This is where you physically have in a safe place at your home, in your room, whatever it is. It doesn't have to be against someone. You do this in your own time, and you tense up, you clench your arms, clench your fists, and you have this temper tantrum. And you could say something like, "You hurt me when," and you say it as if that person's there. And you reenact that anger and emote it out. And it is probably the most alleviating thing for shame, fear, repetition, compulsion, stuff like this. The next one, which is harder to do automatically, is crying. Crying is the most healing because of the hormones, the toxins you eradicate when you cry. It's the most healing. It dissolves a lot of worry. It dissolves a lot of anxiety. And it dissolves shame. Very, very powerful, probably the most powerful. And obviously as guys, we're told not to do this, but this is a humongous grieving source. The point with these grieving techniques is that you're externalizing, emotional pain. If you do not do that, it just gets bound up in our nervous system, waiting to be released. It's kind of all suspended in fear until we unlock it. So crying, again, very, very powerful. Techniques to this, you could look at a lot of, I have found, actors, techniques for crying. So you could use, sad memories. You could, think of scenes maybe even from your childhood what made you sad, and cry about that. You could use emotional music, emotional movie scenes, anything that gets that sadness out, that sorrow. The thing is what you might think that, well, if I'm never angry, I'm never sad, then I must be always happy. But this is far from the truth. These are things that we need to grieve out. We're trying to get to a place of wholeness. We need to embrace all the polarity and all the paradoxes of our emotional state. If you have, think of the continuum of, for example, joy and sorrow. If you find it hard expressing your sorrow, it probably is affecting your joy. You need to be able to grieve out that pain. So, and as well, if you cannot express your anger, then it's probably affecting your calmness. Anger is our protection. People usually with anxiety find it very difficult expressing their anger. And this is why they get anxious, because there's no form of protection for themselves. And then ventilating. Now, this could be written, could be with a journal, or what I have found very beneficial is writing and talking within a group or talking with a friend, really externalizing how I feel about certain things I'm angry about. You can ventilate how sad you are, how angry you are, how confused you are. Maybe you're just ambivalent about something. You don't know what to think about it, but you externalize it through speaking. You can do that on your own. You can do some kind of solo vocal ventilation or with a group. And then the other thing is the final thing, which is a little bit more of a kind of more passive healing modality, is the fully feeling, that you sink into the feelings without feeling a need to escape from them. So, to avoid going to escapism. So, not watching as much TV, not eating when you feel sad, not actually, looking for an escape. So they're the healing modalities. The first 3 I mentioned are probably the most powerful. And really I think depression is really just unresolved grief. It's a case of grieving out the sadness, the anger, ventilating out, and then fully feeling. So I hope people have enjoyed that, and I'll speak to you soon.